Homeless girl saves abandoned baby. But when she finds out who the father is, she breaks down in tears. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this and comment your age. Sarah huddled deeper into the doorway of the abandoned storefront, trying to escape the bitter December wind that cut through her thin jacket like knives. Her stomach cramped painfully. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The last few coins she'd managed to collect had gone to buying a small carton of milk, which was now frozen solid in the paper cup beside her. At 8 years old, she had already learned to be invisible. People's eyes slid past her as if she were part of the dirty concrete, their faces twisting with discomfort or disgust on the rare occasions they did notice her. Her tangled dark hair hung in her face, and her once white sneakers were held together with fraying laces she'd found in a dumpster. The wealthy neighborhood of Millbrook Heights loomed above her, its mansions perched on the hill like castles in a fairy tale she'd never been allowed to enter. Sarah knew better than to venture up there. The security guards were quick to chase away anyone who didn't belong. But today, something made her break her own rules. A sound carried on the wind, faint at first, then growing clearer. A baby's cry. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes scanning the street. There, halfway up the steep hill, a stroller was rolling backward, picking up speed with each passing second. A woman's scream pierced the air from the top of the hill, but she was too far away to reach it in time. Sarah's body moved before her mind could catch up. She sprinted into the street, ignoring the blast of a car horn as she dodged between vehicles. The stroller was moving faster now, headed straight for the busy intersection at the bottom of the hill. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, bare feet slapping against the frozen pavement. With seconds to spare, Sarah grabbed the handle of the stroller, the force nearly yanking her off her feet. She dug her heels in, arms straining as she fought to stop its momentum. The stroller spun, teetering precariously on 2 wheels before settling back on all 4. Inside, a tiny baby girl with wispy blonde hair lay screaming, her face red from crying. She couldn't have been more than 3 months old. Sarah's hands trembled as she checked to make sure the baby wasn't hurt. The infant's clothes were expensive, a designer outfit that probably cost more than Sarah had ever seen in her life. "Oh my God, my baby!" The woman's voice grew closer, her high heels clicking rapidly against the pavement. But before she could reach them, 2 police officers who had been patrolling nearby rushed over, immediately positioning themselves between Sarah and the stroller. "Step away from the baby," one ordered, his hand moving to his belt. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She knew how this looked, a dirty street kid touching a rich woman's baby. "She saved her," a man's voice called out. An elderly gentleman who had been walking his dog hurried forward. "I saw the whole thing. That stroller was headed straight for traffic. This girl ran out and stopped it." The mother reached them then, scooping up her baby with shaking hands. She was beautiful, with perfectly styled hair and clothes that probably cost more than a house. But her face was pale with fear as she clutched her daughter close. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, backing away further. "I didn't mean to. I just didn't want her to get hurt." The woman looked at Sarah then, really looked at her, taking in her ragged clothes and bare feet. Something flickered in her eyes. Pity, perhaps, or guilt. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but Sarah didn't wait to hear what she would say. She turned and ran, ignoring the voices calling after her. She ran until her legs gave out and she collapsed in the alley she called home, her body shaking with exhaustion and cold. That baby's face stayed with her as darkness fell, so small, so helpless, like Sarah had been once. That night, as temperatures dropped below freezing, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the warmth she'd felt while holding that baby. For just a moment, she'd been needed, she'd mattered. But now she was alone again, curled up behind a dumpster, trying to remember what it felt like to be safe. She didn't know that miles away in a mansion on the hill, a woman was still thinking about the dirty little girl who had saved her baby. And she didn't know that this single act of courage would set in motion events that would change her life forever, for better or worse. As Sarah drifted into an uneasy sleep, a black car with tinted windows drove slowly past her alley. Inside, someone was looking for her. Someone who had seen the security footage from the street cameras. Someone who recognized something in her face that had shaken them to their core. But Sarah wouldn't know any of this until it was almost too late. The next morning dawned grey and bitter, with sleet stinging Sarah's face as she huddled in her makeshift shelter. Her stomach felt like it was eating itself, and her throat burned with thirst. The events of yesterday seemed almost like a dream. The baby, the expensive stroller, the look in that wealthy mother's eyes. But her aching muscles reminded her it had been real. Sarah forced herself to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her frozen toes. She needed to find food today, or she wouldn't make it through another night. The soup kitchen on 5th Street had turned her away yesterday. Too many people, not enough food. She'd have to try somewhere else. As she made her way through the awakening city, Sarah noticed something different. People were looking at her more than usual, whispering and pointing at their phones. Her heart rate picked up. Had someone recorded what happened yesterday? Was she in trouble? She quickened her pace, keeping her head down. The convenience store where she sometimes begged for leftover food had its TV on behind the counter. Sarah froze when she saw her own blurry image on the screen. The headline below read, "Mystery Girl Saves Baby, Disappears." The footage showed her grabbing the stroller, then running away. "Hey, isn't that you?" The clerk, an older woman named Marie, who sometimes slipped Sarah day-old sandwiches, was staring at her with wide eyes. "You're all over the news, honey. The baby's parents are looking for you." Sarah's chest tightened with panic. Looking for her? Why? She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? Before Marie could say more, Sarah bolted from the store, her feet carrying her through familiar alleys and shortcuts. She didn't stop running until she reached the abandoned loading dock where she sometimes slept when it rained. Her breath came in ragged gasps, forming clouds in the freezing air. Why would rich people be looking for someone like her? Nothing good ever came from being noticed. As Sarah tried to calm her racing heart, a memory surfaced, one she usually kept locked away. She was 4 years old, clutching her mother's hand as they stood outside a towering office building. Her mother's face was streaked with tears as she begged the security guard to let them in. "Please, he needs to know about his daughter. Please, just let me speak to him." But the guard had pushed them away, threatening to call the police. That was the last time Sarah had seen her mother cry. After that, something in her had hardened, like ice forming over a pond. 6 months later, the illness took her, leaving Sarah alone in the world. A sound pulled Sarah from her memories, footsteps approaching the loading dock. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, hardly daring to breathe. 2 men in expensive suits walked past, talking in low voices. "She has to be around here somewhere," one said, checking his phone. "The boss wants her found today, says it's urgent." "Tadim, what's so special about some homeless kid?" the other asked. "Don't know, don't care. But he's offering 10 grand to whoever finds her first." Sarah's blood turned to ice. $10,000, just to find her. This wasn't about the baby anymore. This was something else, something that made her think of her mother's tears, of unanswered pleas, of secrets she'd never understood. She waited until the men's footsteps faded before creeping out of hiding. She needed to leave this area, fast. But as she turned the corner, she nearly collided with someone. The mother from yesterday, the one whose baby she'd saved. The woman grabbed Sarah's arm before she could run. "Wait, please! I've been looking everywhere for you!" Her grip was gentle but firm, her eyes filled with an emotion Sarah couldn't read. "My name is Rebecca. Please just let me help you. You saved my daughter's life." Sarah tried to pull away, but her strength was fading. She hadn't eaten in so long, and the cold had seeped into her bones. The world started to spin, dark spots dancing at the edges of her vision. "You're freezing," Rebecca gasped, shrugging off her expensive coat and wrapping it around Sarah's shoulders. The warmth was overwhelming, making Sarah's knees buckle. "Please, let me take you somewhere safe, get you some food." Sarah wanted to refuse, to run, but her body betrayed her. As she swayed on her feet, Rebecca caught her, lifting her as easily as she would her own child. The last thing Sarah saw before unconsciousness took her was Rebecca's face, lined with worry, and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. Hours later, Sarah awoke in a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors filling the air. The room was private, luxurious by hospital standards. An IV dripped fluids into her arm, and warm blankets covered her clean body. Someone had washed her while she was unconscious. Rebecca sat in a chair by the bed, the sleeping baby nestled against her chest. But it was the man standing by the window that made Sarah's heart stop. He was tall, with silver hair and a face she knew from somewhere, maybe TV or magazines. He was staring at her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the mattress. "What's your mother's name?" he asked abruptly, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah's throat closed up. She hadn't spoken her mother's name aloud in 4 years, but something in the man's eyes compelled her to answer. "Catherine," she whispered. "Catherine Mitchell." The man's face went white. He gripped the windowsill so hard his knuckles turned pale, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might fall. Rebecca stood quickly, handing the baby to a nurse who had appeared in the doorway. "Michael?" Rebecca touched the man's arm. "What is it? What's wrong?" But he couldn't seem to speak. He just kept staring at Sarah, tears forming in his eyes. And suddenly, Sarah remembered where she'd seen his face before, in a crumpled photograph her mother had kept until the day she died, a photo of a much younger version of this man smiling at the camera, his arm around her mother's waist. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow, making the monitors beep faster as her heart rate spiked. But before anyone could say another word, more people burst into the room, men in suits, doctors, nurses, all talking at once. The noise and confusion overwhelmed Sarah's weakened body. As darkness crept in again, she heard the man, Michael, say something that would change everything. "Don't let anyone near her. She's my daughter." The machines wailed as Sarah's consciousness faded, her last thought a desperate wish that she'd never left her alley, never saved that baby, never set in motion whatever was happening now. Because something told her that this was just the beginning, and that the suffering she'd known on the streets might seem simple compared to what was coming next. The next few days passed in a blur of doctors, tests, and whispered conversations outside Sarah's hospital room door. The luxury suite felt like a prison, despite its comfortable bed and private bathroom. Every time she tried to get up, someone would rush in and insist she rest. Her body was severely malnourished, they said. She could have died from exposure. The words washed over her like meaningless waves. Michael, she couldn't bring herself to think of him as anything else, came every day, sitting silently in the chair beside her bed. Sometimes he'd try to speak, opening his mouth only to close it again, his eyes filled with a pain that made Sarah uncomfortable. She preferred when Rebecca visited, bringing baby Emma, who had somehow become a strange source of comfort. At least with them, she didn't feel the weight of years of abandonment pressing down on her chest. On the 4th day, Sarah finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been burning inside her. "Did you know?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but Michael flinched as if she'd shouted, "Did you know about me? About Mom?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Michael ran a hand through his silver hair, looking suddenly old and tired. "I knew about Catherine's pregnancy," he admitted, each word seeming to cause him physical pain. "She tried to tell me, tried to contact me many times. I was a coward, Sarah. I had just started my company, was engaged to someone else. I convinced myself she was lying, that she just wanted money. Sarah's hands clenched the blanket so hard her knuckles turned white. "She died," she said flatly, watching him flinch again. "She got sick, and we had no money for doctors. She died in a homeless shelter while I watched." Michael made a sound like he'd been punched, dropping his head into his hands. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear to God, I didn't know she'd died. I told myself she must have figured things out, moved away, found someone else to help raise." "Stop!" Sarah's voice cracked. "Just stop. You didn't want to know. That's different from not knowing." The truth of her words hung in the air between them. Outside the room, nurses moved efficiently through their rounds, machines beeped, life continued as normal. But inside, time seemed suspended in amber, trapping them both in this moment of reckoning. "You're right," Michael finally said, lifting his head to reveal tears tracking down his face. "I chose not to know. And that choice, it cost you everything, cost Catherine her life. I can never undo that damage, never make it right. But Sarah, please let me try to help you now." Sarah turned her face away, staring out the window at the city skyline. Somewhere out there were her familiar alleys, the loading dock, the dumpsters she'd searched for food. That life had been hard, brutal even, but at least she'd understood it. This was like trying to breathe underwater. A soft knock interrupted the tension. Rebecca entered, carrying Emma, who was fussing quietly. Without thinking, Sarah held out her arms, and Rebecca carefully transferred the baby to her. Emma immediately quieted, her tiny fingers wrapping around one of Sarah's. The simple trust of it made Sarah's throat tight. "The doctors say you can be discharged tomorrow," Rebecca said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Michael and we've prepared a room for you. At our house." Sarah's head snapped up, her heart racing. I don't belong there." "You belong exactly there," Michael interjected, his voice stronger now. "You're my daughter, Sarah, my flesh and blood. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but please, give us a chance to show you what family can be." Family. The word felt like broken glass in Sarah's mouth. Her family had died on a thin mattress in a crowded shelter, holding her hand and whispering apologies until the very end. These people, with their wealth and their guilt and their good intentions, they weren't family. They were strangers who happened to share her blood. But as Emma cooed in her arms, Sarah felt her resolve wavering. The baby needed her, or at least that's what she told herself. The truth, the painful, terrifying truth, was that maybe she needed them too. 4 years of survival had left her empty, hollow, barely human sometimes. The warmth of Emma's small body against hers was like a spark in that darkness, threatening to ignite something she'd thought long dead. "I'll stay," she heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere deep inside. "But not for you." She looked directly at Michael. "I'm staying for Emma. And because," she swallowed hard, "because Mom would have wanted me to have a chance at a real life." The relief on Michael's face was almost painful to watch. He reached for her hand but stopped when she stiffened. Accepting his offer was one thing. Forgiveness was something else entirely. That night, after everyone had left, Sarah lay awake in her hospital bed, thinking about the future that stretched before her like an unknown country. She thought about her mother, wondering if she was watching from somewhere, if she would understand Sarah's decision. The memory of her final words surfaced. "Stay strong, my brave girl. Someday, everything will make sense." But nothing made sense. Not Michael's sudden appearance in her life, not Rebecca's kindness, not the way baby Emma seemed to need her. And certainly not the whispered conversation she'd overheard earlier between 2 nurses. "Did you hear? Someone tried to break into her room last night. Security caught them, but they got away." Really? Why would anyone want to hurt a homeless kid? That's just it. She's not just any homeless kid. Haven't you heard the rumors about who her real mother was, what she knew? The conversation had been cut short when they noticed Sarah was awake, but the words echoed in her mind. What had her mother known? What secrets had died with her in that shelter? And why, after all these years, did they still matter enough for someone to try to break into her hospital room? Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly cold despite the room's warmth. Tomorrow she would leave with Michael and Rebecca, step into a life so foreign it might as well be another planet. But something told her that the hardest part of her journey was still ahead. The streets had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that she was walking into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple family reunion. As if confirming her fears, a shadow passed by her door, too quickly to be a nurse doing rounds, too quietly to be a doctor. Sarah held her breath, counting the seconds until it passed. When she finally exhaled, her decision was made. She would go with them tomorrow, enter their world of wealth and privilege, but she would keep her guard up, her senses alert, because something wasn't right here, and until she figured out what it was, she couldn't afford to trust anyone, not even the man who called himself her father. The monitors beside her bed beeped steadily, marking time as the night crept forward. Somewhere in the city, her mother's ghost whispered secrets to the wind, and shadows moved with purpose through darkened streets. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter, but tonight Sarah lay awake, watching her door and wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The mansion loomed before Sarah like something from another world. 3 stories of pristine white stone and gleaming windows stretched toward the winter sky, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens now dusted with frost. The circular driveway alone was bigger than any space she'd called home in the past 4 years. Her fingers clutched the small backpack of donated clothes the hospital had given her, the only possessions she had in the world. Rebecca's hand touched her shoulder gently. "Are you ready to go in?" The woman's voice was kind, but Sarah couldn't help noticing how she positioned herself between Sarah and the front door, as if afraid the girl might bolt. She wasn't wrong to worry. Every instinct Sarah had developed on the streets was screaming at her to run. Michael walked ahead of them, carrying Emma, who was bundled against the cold. He unlocked the front door with shaking hands, and Sarah wondered if he was as nervous as she was. The thought brought her no comfort. The entrance hall was bigger than the entire homeless shelter where her mother had died. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on marble floors, so polished Sarah could see her reflection, a small, thin figure drowning in new clothes that couldn't quite hide how broken she was. A grand staircase curved upward, its mahogany railings gleaming with generations of care and polish. "Would you like to see your room?" Rebecca asked softly. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She followed Rebecca up the stairs, hyper-aware of every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corners. Living on the streets had taught her to always know her escape routes. The room they led her to was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a long hallway. Rebecca opened the door, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The space was larger than any bedroom she'd ever seen, painted in soft blues and grays. A queen-sized bed piled with pillows dominated one wall, while a window seat looked out over the gardens. There was a desk, a bookshelf filled with books, and a door that presumably led to a private bathroom. "We weren't sure what colors you'd like," Rebecca said, fidgeting with her wedding ring. "We can change anything you don't." "It's fine," Sarah interrupted, her voice hollow. How could she explain that the softness of it all felt like it was suffocating her, that she'd gotten used to hard concrete and cold wind, that comfort had become a foreign language she no longer spoke? "I'll let you get settled," Rebecca said after a moment of awkward silence. "Dinner's at 6, but if you're tired, we can bring something up." "I'll come down," Sarah said quickly. The thought of eating alone in this huge room made her skin crawl. Besides, she needed to learn the layout of the house, understand its rhythms. Survival habits died hard. After Rebecca left, Sarah stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do with herself. The backpack felt heavy in her hands, though it contained almost nothing. Slowly, she walked to the window seat and sat down, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. From here, she could see the iron gates at the entrance to the property, the security cameras mounted discreetly at regular intervals. A prison, no matter how gilded, was still a prison. A soft knock made her jump. Michael stood in the doorway, Emma sleeping against his shoulder. "May I come in?" he asked, as if this wasn't his house, as if she had any real power to refuse him. Sarah shrugged, continuing to stare out the window. She heard him enter, his expensive shoes silent on the thick carpet. He sat in a chair near the window seat, careful to maintain his distance. "There's something you should know," he said after a long moment. "Something I should have told you at the hospital, but I was afraid." Sarah turned to look at him then, surprised by the admission. Fear wasn't something rich men were supposed to admit to. "The night before your mother." He paused, swallowing hard. "The night before she died, she sent me an email. I never opened it. I had my assistant send a form response, telling her to stop contacting me. But I kept it. I don't know why, but I never deleted it." Sarah's heart began to pound. "What did it say?" "I don't know. I've never been able to bring myself to read it, but..." He shifted Emma to his other shoulder, reaching into his pocket with his free hand. He withdrew a small USB drive. "Everything she ever sent me is on here. Emails, letters, voicemails I never listened to. I've carried it with me every day since I found out about her death, as a reminder of my cowardice. It's yours now if you want it." Sarah stared at the tiny device. It looked so innocent, just a small piece of plastic and metal, but it contained her mother's voice, her words, her last attempts to reach the man who had abandoned them. "Why give it to me now?" Michael's face was grave. "Because you deserve to know everything. And because..." He glanced toward the window, his expression darkening. "Because there are people who might not want you to know what's on here. The attempt to break into your hospital room wasn't random, Sarah. Someone knows who you are, who your mother was, and they're afraid of what she might have told you." "I don't know anything," Sarah said, her voice cracking. She protected me from everything. Even at the end, she just kept apologizing, kept telling me to be strong. Catherine was..." Michael's voice caught. "She worked for my company before you were born, in the legal department. She was brilliant, noticed things others missed. And then one day, she quit suddenly. A week later, she told me she was pregnant. I always wondered if the two things were connected, but I was too much of a coward to ask." Sarah's fingers closed around the USB drive, its edges digging into her palm. "You think she found something? Something bad?" "I think," Michael said carefully, "that your mother was the most honest person I ever knew, and that honesty can be very dangerous in the corporate world." He stood, adjusting Emma, who was starting to fuss. "Whatever's on that drive, it's yours to decide what to do with it. But Sarah..." His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw real fear in them. "Be careful who you trust, even in this house." He left her then, closing the door softly behind him. Sarah sat frozen, staring at the USB drive in her hand. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. A black car drove slowly past the gates, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat when it paused briefly before continuing on. The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in her palm. Part of her wanted to plug it in immediately, to finally hear her mother's voice again, to understand what secrets had died with her. But another part, the part that had kept her alive on the streets, urged caution. Knowledge was power, but it could also be deadly. A soft cry from down the hall broke through her thoughts. Emma, wanting attention or comfort, or both. Sarah tucked the USB drive into her sock, the safest place she could think of. Then she stood, squaring her shoulders. She had survived 4 years on the streets, fought off predators both human and animal, endured cold and hunger and despair. Whatever truth was hidden in her mother's last words, whatever danger lurked behind these pristine walls, she would face it. But first, she needed to understand this new world she'd been thrust into, starting with dinner, where she would watch and listen and learn. Because one thing her mother had taught her in those final days in the shelter was that sometimes the most dangerous predators were the ones who smiled the most convincingly. As she walked down the hallway toward Emma's cries, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not by the obvious security cameras, but by something else, something hidden in the shadows of this perfect house. Her mother's last words echoed in her mind. "Stay strong, my brave girl. Someday, everything will make sense." Sarah hoped that day would come before it was too late, because something told her that the truth on that USB drive wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, and possibly about her future, a future that seemed to grow more dangerous with every passing hour. Dinner was an exercise in barely contained anxiety. The dining room, with its crystal chandelier and antique furniture, made Sarah feel like she was performing in a play she hadn't rehearsed. Her hands shook as she tried to hold the silver properly, conscious of Rebecca's careful glances and Michael's poorly disguised concern. The food, some kind of roasted chicken with vegetables she couldn't name, sat like lead in her stomach. The silence was broken only by Emma's occasional babbles from her high chair. The baby seemed to be the only one comfortable with the situation, reaching toward Sarah with tiny grabbing hands whenever she caught her eye. Despite her unease, Sarah found herself responding to those gestures, making silly faces when no one was looking. "I've arranged for a tutor to come tomorrow," Michael said suddenly, his voice too loud in the quiet room, "to assess where you are academically. We'll need to get you caught up if you're going to start school next semester." The fork slipped from Sarah's fingers, clattering against the fine china plate. School. The word felt like a foreign language. She hadn't been in a classroom since her mother got sick. It's just an assessment," Rebecca interjected quickly, shooting Michael a warning look. "No pressure. We just want to help you get back on track." Back on track. As if her life had simply derailed temporarily, rather than being systematically destroyed by poverty and abandonment. Sarah pushed her plate away, no longer able to pretend she could eat. "May I be excused?" she asked, the formal words feeling strange in her mouth. "On the streets, you just left when you needed to. All these rules, these expectations, they were suffocating her." "Of course," Rebecca said softly. "Would you like to take Emma up for her bedtime? She seems to have really bonded with you." Sarah nodded, grateful for the excuse to escape. She carefully lifted Emma from her high chair, breathing in the baby's powder-fresh scent. At least, with Emma, she didn't have to pretend to be something she wasn't. As she climbed the stairs, she heard Michael and Rebecca's voices rise in what seemed to be an argument. Though she couldn't make out the words, she quickened her pace, not wanting to hear whatever they were saying about her. Emma's nursery was a paradise of soft colors and plush toys. Sarah sat in the rocking chair, holding the baby close as she hummed a tune her mother used to sing. Emma's eyes grew heavy. Her tiny fingers curled around one of Sarah's. The simple trust of it made Sarah's chest ache. "I'll protect you," she whispered to the sleeping baby. "Whatever's going on here, I won't let anything happen to you." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Sarah tensed, but no one appeared in the doorway. Still, she could have sworn she heard breathing, the soft rustle of expensive fabric. She waited until the presence, whatever it was, moved away before laying Emma in her crib. Back in her room, Sarah finally allowed herself to take out the USB drive. Her laptop, another gift from the hospital stay, hummed to life. Her hands trembled as she plugged in the drive. Dozens of files appeared on the screen. Emails, voice recordings, scanned letters, all from her mother to Michael. Sarah clicked on the oldest email first, dated just days after her mother had quit her job. "Michael, I know you won't want to hear this, but what I found in the Thompson case files can't be ignored. The signatures don't match. The dates are wrong. Someone has been falsifying documents, and it goes all the way to the top. I have copies of everything. I need to meet with you privately to discuss this. Catherine. Sarah's breath caught. She clicked on the next email, then the next. Each one grew more urgent, more desperate. Her mother had uncovered something big enough to make her run. And then, mixed in with the business concerns, came the personal news. She was pregnant. The emails changed tone then, becoming pleas not just for justice, but for acknowledgement, for support. The final email, the one sent the night before she died, was still unopened. Sarah's cursor hovered over it, her heart pounding. But before she could click, a noise from her bathroom made her freeze. Someone was in there. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, yanking out the USB drive and shoving it back in her sock. The bathroom door began to open slowly, and she looked frantically around for a weapon, anything she could use to defend herself. But it was Rebecca who stepped out, her face pale. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, raising her hands. "I knocked, but you didn't hear me. I was just leaving some fresh towels." "How long were you in there?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. "What did you see?" "Nothing, I just—" Rebecca stopped, something shifting in her expression. "Sarah, is there something you want to tell me? Something about your mother?" "No." The word came out hard, final. "I'm tired. I'd like to go to bed now." Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Just, Sarah, whatever you're looking for, whatever you're afraid of, you can trust us. We're your family now." But as Rebecca left, closing the door behind her, Sarah noticed her hands were shaking, and she could have sworn she heard her pull out a phone, dialing numbers as she walked away. Sarah waited until the footsteps faded before pulling out the USB drive again. But she didn't plug it back in. Instead, she pried up the loose floorboard she'd noticed earlier, tucking the drive into the small space beneath. She couldn't risk anyone finding it, not until she knew who she could trust. That night she lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the huge house. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every distant sound could be footsteps. The comfort of the bed felt wrong after so long sleeping on concrete, and the silence was somehow louder than any city noise. Emma's cry pierced the darkness, and Sarah was on her feet before she could think. She padded down the hallway to the nursery, where she found Rebecca already holding the baby. "She's just hungry," Rebecca said, but something in her voice was off. She was looking at Sarah with an expression that seemed almost afraid. "You should go back to bed." But Sarah lingered in the doorway, watching as Rebecca fed Emma a bottle. There was something mechanical about her movements, something that didn't match the maternal warmth she'd shown before. And when she thought Sarah wasn't looking, she pulled out her phone again, typing rapidly with one hand. Sarah retreated to her room, but she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the window, watching as a series of cars drove past the gates, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Each one slowed as it passed, as if searching for something or someone. Her mother's words from the emails echoed in her mind. It goes all the way to the top. But what was it? What had her mother discovered that was worth dying for? And more importantly, who else knew about it? The night crept on, and Sarah remained vigilant, because now she wasn't just protecting herself anymore. Whatever danger lurked in this house, whatever secrets her mother had tried to expose, they weren't just about the past. They were about the present, about Emma, about the fragile new life Sarah had stumbled into. And somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching, waiting, planning. Sarah could feel it in her bones, the same way she'd learned to sense danger on the streets. But this time, running wasn't an option. Not with Emma to protect, not with her mother's truth still hidden, not with so many questions left unanswered. As dawn began to break, Sarah made a decision. She would play their game, pretend to be the grateful rescued orphan. But beneath that facade, she would be watching, learning, gathering evidence. Because one thing was becoming clear: this perfect family, this beautiful house, this seemingly chance reunion, none of it was what it seemed. And Sarah had a feeling that uncovering the truth might cost her everything, maybe even her life. Morning brought new tensions to the mansion. Sarah sat across from a stern-faced tutor in Michael's study, her mind racing as she tried to focus on the assessment questions. But her attention kept drifting to the conversation she'd overheard at dawn, Rebecca's urgent whispers into her phone in the garden below Sarah's window. "We can't wait any longer," Rebecca had said, her voice tight with stress. "She's starting to look through Catherine's things. If she finds—" "No, I understand. Yes, I'll handle it. Today." The tutor's voice snapped Sarah back to the present. "Miss Mitchell, are you listening?" Sarah forced herself to nod, looking down at the math problem she was supposed to be solving. Numbers swam before her eyes as she remembered the way Rebecca had been watching her at breakfast, something calculating behind her concerned smile. A cry from down the hall made Sarah's head snap up. Emma. But this wasn't her usual cry. This was different, desperate. Sarah was on her feet before the tutor could protest, racing toward the nursery. She found Rebecca trying to soothe a screaming Emma, but something was wrong. The baby's face was red, her breathing labored. "She just started crying," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "I don't know what's wrong." Sarah took Emma from Rebecca's arms and immediately felt the heat radiating from the baby's small body. "She's burning up," Sarah said, her street instincts kicking in. She'd seen enough sick children in the shelters to know when something was seriously wrong. "We need to get her to a hospital." "No!" Rebecca's response was too quick, too sharp. "I mean, I'll call our private doctor. He can be here in 20 minutes. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was already heading for the stairs. Emma clutched to her chest. "She needs help now," she said firmly. Behind her, she heard Rebecca speaking urgently into her phone again. But she didn't stop to listen. Michael appeared in the foyer, his face concerned. "What's happening?" "Emma's sick," Sarah said, trying to push past him. "She needs a doctor." Michael's hand caught her arm, gentle but firm. "Wait, Sarah. Let's not overreact. Rebecca's calling our doctor. Let go of me." Sarah's voice was low, dangerous. 4 years on the streets had taught her when adults couldn't be trusted, especially ones who claimed to care about you. "Either drive us to the hospital or get out of my way." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Michael's hand dropped. "I'll get the car," he said quickly. The drive to the hospital was tense. Emma's crying had subsided to whimpers, but her breathing was still labored. Sarah sat in the back with her, monitoring every breath, while Michael drove and Rebecca made more phone calls in the passenger seat. In the emergency room, everything happened quickly. Doctors whisked Emma away for tests, leaving Sarah standing in the waiting room with Michael and Rebecca. A nurse approached with admission forms, and Sarah watched as Rebecca filled them out, noting how her hand hesitated over certain sections. "Medical history," the nurse read aloud. "Any allergies or previous conditions we should know about?" "No," Rebecca said quickly. "She's been perfectly healthy." But Sarah saw it. The slight tremor in Rebecca's hand, the way she wouldn't meet the nurse's eyes. She was lying. About what? Sarah didn't know, but she was definitely hiding something. Hours passed in tense silence. Sarah paced the waiting room, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. The way Rebecca had resisted coming to the hospital, those mysterious phone calls, the hesitation over Emma's medical history. Finally, a doctor appeared. "Mrs. Anderson, a word in private, please." Rebecca stood, but Sarah moved closer, straining to hear their hushed conversation around the corner. "Traces of an unusual substance in her blood work," the doctor was saying. "Combined with her symptoms, it suggests—" "That's impossible," Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp. "No one could have—" "Mrs. Anderson, given the circumstances, we're required to report any suspicious—" "Do you know who my husband is?" Rebecca's voice had changed, become harder. "This conversation never happened. Understand?" Sarah's blood ran cold. She backed away quietly, her mind working furiously. Something was very wrong here. She needed to see those test results, needed to understand what they'd found in Emma's blood. When Rebecca returned to the waiting room, her face was composed, but her hands were shaking. "Emma's going to be fine." she announced. "Just a fever. They want to keep her overnight for observation, but we can take her home tomorrow." Michael seemed relieved, but Sarah wasn't fooled. She watched as Rebecca made another phone call, speaking too quietly to overhear. Whatever was happening, whatever they were hiding, it had something to do with Emma. And somehow, Sarah suspected it was connected to her mother's emails, to the secrets that had gotten her killed. That night, Sarah refused to leave the hospital. She sat by Emma's crib, watching the baby sleep, now peaceful after being given medication. Rebecca had tried to convince her to go home, but Sarah had been adamant. She wasn't leaving Emma alone, not now. Around midnight, Sarah pretended to doze in her chair, but she was wide awake, listening. Sure enough, soft footsteps approached, too quiet to be a nurse's squeaky shoes. She kept her breathing even as someone entered the room. Through barely opened eyes, she saw a man in scrubs she didn't recognize. He moved to Emma's crib, reaching for the IV line. Sarah's hand closed around the metal bedpan she'd positioned earlier, ready to use as a weapon. But before she could move, another figure appeared in the doorway. "Stop!" a familiar voice whispered. "Not while she's watching. We'll find another way." The man withdrew, and Sarah caught a glimpse of Rebecca's face in the doorway before both disappeared. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure they must have heard it. She waited until their footsteps faded before moving to Emma's crib. The baby slept on, unaware of what had almost happened. Sarah checked the IV line, making sure it hadn't been tampered with. Her mind was racing. They had tried to do something to Emma, or had they been trying to undo something already done? The doctor's words echoed in her head. Traces of an unusual substance. Sarah pulled out her phone, opening the Notes app where she'd been tracking everything suspicious since arriving at the mansion. She added tonight's events, then stared at the pattern emerging. Rebecca's strange behavior, the mysterious phone calls, Emma's sudden illness, the attempted interference with her IV, and underneath it all, her mother's urgent emails about falsified documents and corruption at the highest levels. She looked down at Emma, so small and vulnerable in her hospital crib. "What are they doing to you?" she whispered. "And what does it have to do with what my mom discovered?" A noise in the hallway made her quickly pocket her phone. A real nurse entered this time, checking Emma's vitals. "Everything okay in here, honey?" she asked kindly. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already formulating a plan. Tomorrow, when they took Emma home, she would need to act. She needed to get to those medical records, needed to understand what they'd found in Emma's blood. And somehow, she needed to finish reading her mother's emails. Because now she was sure, whatever her mother had discovered, whatever had gotten her killed, it wasn't just about corporate corruption. It was about something much darker, something that was happening right now, in this perfect family to an innocent baby. And Sarah was the only one who could stop it. As she settled back in her chair for her vigil, Sarah thought about how strange life was. A week ago, she'd been sleeping behind dumpsters, fighting for survival. Now she was fighting for something much bigger, the truth, justice for her mother, and most importantly, Emma's safety. The night stretched ahead, long and dangerous. But Sarah had survived 4 years on the streets. She knew how to stay awake, how to watch, how to protect. And tomorrow, when Rebecca and Michael tried to take Emma home, she would be ready. Because one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. The real danger wasn't out there in the streets. It was here, in this hospital, in that mansion, in the perfect smiles and gentle words of people who claimed to be family. And Sarah was done being fooled by pretty lies. The drive home from the hospital was thick with unspoken tension. Sarah sat in the back seat with Emma, who was sleeping peacefully in her car seat, while Rebecca kept glancing at them through the rearview mirror. Michael had stayed behind, claiming an urgent business meeting, but Sarah had seen him arguing with Rebecca in hushed tones before they left. Sarah's backpack sat at her feet, containing more than just her meager belongings now. During a moment when Rebecca had been distracted with discharge paperwork, Sarah had managed to slip into the records room. The young intern she'd befriended during her night watch had been all too happy to help her research pediatric care. A few carefully chosen words about her interest in becoming a nurse had earned her 15 precious minutes with Emma's file. What she'd found had made her blood run cold. The unusual substance the doctor had mentioned wasn't just some random toxin. It was an experimental compound, one that had been administered regularly over weeks. The notes mentioned Project Butterfly and referenced a series of clinical trials that had been shut down 3 years ago after several infant deaths. But most disturbing of all was the signature at the bottom of the authorization forms. Catherine Mitchell, Legal Department, Anderson Pharmaceuticals. Her mother's signature, dated just weeks before she'd quit her job, before she'd discovered she was pregnant with Sarah. Now, as they pulled into the mansion's circular driveway, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Had her mother discovered what they were doing with Project Butterfly? Was that why she'd run? Why she'd tried so desperately to reach Michael? Sarah, Rebecca's voice cut through her thoughts. Would you like to put Emma down for her nap while I prepare her medication? Sarah's arms tightened instinctively around Emma as she carried her from the car. The doctor didn't prescribe any medication, she said carefully, watching Rebecca's reaction. Oh, just some baby Tylenol, Rebecca said smoothly, but her hands were shaking as she unlocked the front door. In case her fever comes back. Sarah followed Rebecca inside, every sense on high alert. The house felt different now, its elegant facades hiding something sinister. As they climbed the stairs, Sarah noticed new security cameras had been installed, ones that hadn't been there 2 days ago. In the nursery, Sarah laid Emma in her crib, humming softly until the baby's eyes fluttered closed. Rebecca hovered in the doorway, her presence making the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. You're so good with her, Rebecca said softly, almost like you were meant to find her that day. Sarah's hands stilled on the crib railing. What do you mean? Just that sometimes things work out in unexpected ways. The right person, in the right place, at the right time. Rebecca's voice had taken on an odd quality, almost dreamy. We'd been so worried about finding someone suitable. The previous trials had failed because the subjects weren't compatible. Sarah's heart began to pound. She turned slowly to face Rebecca, keeping herself between the woman and Emma's crib. What trials? Rebecca's face changed, as if realizing she'd said too much. Nothing, dear. I'm just tired. It's been a long few days. But Sarah wasn't letting it go. Not now. Project Butterfly, she said, watching Rebecca's face pale. That's what you're talking about, isn't it? What are you doing to Emma? You don't understand, Rebecca said, taking a step forward. This is bigger than you, bigger than Emma. We're trying to save lives. By experimenting on babies, Sarah's voice shook with rage. By killing them when the experiments fail. Those were unfortunate mistakes, Rebecca said, her gentle demeanor cracking. We've refined the process now. Emma is special. Her genetic makeup is perfect for the treatment, and with you here, providing the secondary genetic markers we need. Sarah felt sick. That's why you kept me here? To use me in your experiments? Use you? Rebecca laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, Sarah, you're not just a test subject, you're the key. Your mother's genetics combined with Michael's. It's what we've been trying to replicate for years. Why do you think we worked so hard to find you? The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The stroller, that wasn't an accident, was it? Rebecca's silence was answer enough. Sarah's mind raced back to that day, the stroller rolling downhill, her instinctive rush to save the baby. They had staged it all, knowing she wouldn't be able to ignore a child in danger. Your mother understood in the end, Rebecca continued, her voice turning hard. She saw the potential of what we were doing, but then she got scared, threatened to expose everything. We couldn't let that happen. You killed her. Sarah whispered, the truth finally clicking into place. You made it look like she died from illness, but you murdered her. She made her choice, Rebecca said coldly, just like you're going to make yours now. Sarah heard movement behind her. Someone else had entered the nursery. She spun around to see a man in a white coat holding a syringe. Don't fight it, Sarah, Rebecca said almost gently. This is what you were meant for, you and Emma both. Your genetics, combined with the Project Butterfly protocols. We're going to change the world. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Street instincts took over. She grabbed the heavy lamp from the changing table and hurled it at the man with the syringe. In the confusion, she scooped Emma from her crib and ran. She could hear shouts behind her, footsteps thundering on the stairs, but she knew this house now, knew its shadows and hiding places. She ducked into a service corridor, holding Emma close as the baby began to whimper. Shh, sweet girl, she whispered, her heart pounding. I won't let them hurt you anymore. Sarah reached into her sock, pulling out her mother's USB drive. She had to get this information out, had to expose what they were doing. But first, she needed to get Emma somewhere safe. The sound of voices grew closer. Sarah looked around desperately, trying to formulate a plan. She couldn't go down. They would be watching the exits, up then. The attic had a window that opened onto the roof, and from there, a floorboard creaked behind her. Sarah spun around to find Michael standing there, his face a mask of anguish. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I never wanted any of this. I thought I could protect you both. You knew, Sarah said, her voice breaking. You knew what they were doing to Emma, what they did to my mother. Your mother was right, Michael said, taking a step closer. About everything, the company, Project Butterfly, all of it. I was a coward then, and I'm a coward now. But Sarah, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a key. The garage, my blue Audi. The keys are in it, and there's money in the glove compartment. Get Emma out of here. Take her far away from this place. Before Sarah could respond, voices echoed from the stairwell. Michael pushed her toward the attic stairs. Go, I'll hold them off as long as I can. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, looking at the man who had failed her so many times. But there was no time for reconciliation or forgiveness. Emma's life was at stake. She ran up the attic stairs, her mother's final email still unread on the USB drive in her pocket, her heart pounding with the weight of everything she'd discovered. Behind her, she could hear Michael's voice, loud and angry, buying her precious seconds. But as she reached the attic door, Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't over. Because if what Rebecca had said was true, if Project Butterfly was as important as they claimed, they would never stop looking for them. The real question was, how far would Sarah go to protect Emma? And would she be strong enough to finish what her mother had started, even if it meant sacrificing everything, maybe even her own life? The answer, she realized as she looked down at Emma's innocent face, was already clear, because some things were worth dying for, and some truths had to be told, no matter the cost. The attic air was thick with dust and desperation as Sarah worked to open the window one-handed, keeping Emma clutched close to her chest. The baby was remarkably quiet, as if sensing the gravity of their situation. Below, she could hear the chaos erupting. Michael's voice raised in anger, Rebecca's sharp commands, the sound of running feet on stairs. The window finally gave way with a groan of ancient wood. Cold winter air rushed in, making Emma whimper softly. Sarah shrugged off her jacket, wrapping it carefully around the baby before securing her in the makeshift sling she'd created from a curtain cord. 4 years on the streets had taught her how to improvise, how to protect what mattered most. The roof stretched out before her, its slate tiles slick with frost. Getting down wouldn't be easy, but she'd climbed worse things to escape danger in her years alone. What worried her more was what would come after. They had resources, connections. How far could she really run? A crash from below made her decision for her. Sarah climbed carefully onto the window ledge, testing her footing on the icy roof. The garage was 2 stories below and slightly to the left. If she could make it to the decorative trellis on the side of the house, she's in the attic. Rebecca's voice carried clearly through the open window. Don't let her leave with that baby. Sarah began moving, each step careful and measured despite her racing heart. Emma stayed perfectly still against her chest. Her tiny hands curled into Sarah's shirt. The wind pulled at them, threatening their balance, but Sarah kept going. She couldn't fail, not now, not with everything at stake. Halfway to the trellis, she heard the attic door burst open behind her. Without looking back, she knew they would be coming through the window soon. Her fingers found her pocket, checking that the USB drive was still secure. Her mother's last words, the truth about Project Butterfly. It all had to survive, had to be exposed. The trellis was old but sturdy, its lattice offering decent handholds, despite the ice. Sarah began her descent, trying to ignore the shouts above her. Emma stirred against her chest, but remained remarkably calm. Brave girl, Sarah thought, just like her mother had told her to be. She was nearly to the ground when she heard the engine start, not Michael's Audi, but something else. Headlights swept the driveway as a black SUV pulled up, its tinted windows hiding its occupants. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, praying the shadows would hide them. The SUV's door opened and a man stepped out, tall, distinguished-looking, with steel-grey hair and an expensive suit. "Did you find them?" he called up to the roof, his voice carrying authority and barely contained rage. "Working on it, sir," someone shouted back. "She's on the ground somewhere." "Find them," the man ordered. "That baby is worth millions in research potential, and the girl—" He paused, his voice hardening. "The girl knows too much, like her mother did." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. She'd heard it in her memories, in the background of her mother's desperate pleas that day outside the office building. This was the man her mother had been trying to expose, the one behind everything. A sound to her left made her turn her head. Through the garage's side door, she could see Michael crouched behind his Audi, motioning frantically for her to run to him. But something in his expression made her hesitate. The way his eyes kept darting to the man in the driveway, the tremor in his hands. "Check the garage," Rebecca's voice rang out from above. "She'll try for a car." Sarah made her decision. Instead of running to Michael, she slipped around the corner of the house, keeping to the deepest shadows. Behind her, she heard the garage door opening, voices calling out. But she had learned long ago that sometimes the most obvious escape route was the most dangerous. The kitchen garden stretched out before her, its carefully maintained beds now frosted and bare. Beyond it lay the high stone wall that surrounded the property. Sarah moved quickly but quietly, years of avoiding danger guiding her steps. Emma's warmth against her chest gave her strength, purpose. She was halfway across the garden when the floodlights blazed to life, bathing everything in harsh white light. A shout went up. She'd been spotted. Sarah abandoned stealth for speed, running full out toward the wall. Behind her, feet pounded on frozen earth, voices called out commands. The wall loomed before her, too high to climb while carrying Emma. But Sarah had noticed something earlier, during her careful observation of the grounds, an old drainage pipe, partially hidden by overgrown ivy. If she could just reach it. A hand grabbed her arm, spinning her around. Michael stood there, his face tortured. "Sarah, wait. You don't understand. We can protect you both, like you protected my mother." Sarah wrenched her arm free, backing toward the wall. "She trusted you once too. Your mother made her choice." The distinguished man's voice cut through the night. He was walking toward them slowly, Rebecca and several security guards flanking him. A regrettable one, but necessary for the greater good. "Just like the choice you're about to make, Sarah." Sarah's back hit the wall. Emma stirred against her chest, letting out a small cry that cut through the tension like a knife. "Listen to that cry," the man said, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "Do you know what that sound represents? Hope, the future, Project Butterfly isn't just about profit, it's about evolution, human advancement. Your mother couldn't see that, but you're smarter than she was, aren't you? You're insane, Sarah whispered, her hand finding the USB drive in her pocket. You're experimenting on babies, killing them when they don't meet your standards. Sacrifices must be made for progress, he replied calmly. Your mother understood that in the end. Right before she made her final sacrifice, the truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. You were there, she said, her voice shaking, at the shelter. When she died, the man's smile was cold, a mild poison, untraceable, painless really, much kinder than what awaits you if you don't cooperate now. Sarah looked around desperately. They had her surrounded, Michael standing uncertainly between her and the others, Rebecca's face tight with determination, the security guards moving to cut off any escape route. But they had made one crucial mistake. They thought she was trapped against the wall, cornered like an animal. They didn't know about the drainage pipe, hidden just inches to her left. They didn't know about the years she'd spent learning to disappear, to survive when everyone thought she was finished. Most importantly, they didn't know about the phone in her pocket, connected to a live stream that had been running since she left the attic. Everything they had just said, every confession, every threat, it was all being recorded and uploaded to a server address she'd memorized from her mother's final email. The truth was already out there. Now, she just had to survive long enough to make sure it was heard. Sarah looked down at Emma, then back at the people who had destroyed her mother, who had experimented on innocent babies, who thought they could play God without consequences. She thought about the years she'd spent alone, cold, hungry, afraid, and something inside her hardened into steel. You're right about one thing, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. Sacrifices must be made for progress. Then she moved faster than any of them expected toward the hidden drain pipe. Behind her, chaos erupted. But Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't afford to, because the real fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Emma, for her mother's memory, for every child these people had hurt in their quest for power and progress. The night stretched out before her, full of danger and possibility. But for the first time since her mother died, Sarah knew exactly what she had to do. The only question was, would she survive long enough to do it? The drainage pipe was narrower than Sarah remembered, its rusty edges threatening to snag her clothes as she squeezed through. Emma remained miraculously quiet, tucked safely against her chest. Behind them, voices shouted in confusion, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as their pursuers tried to figure out where they'd gone. Sarah emerged on the other side of the wall, her heart pounding. She couldn't go to the police, not with how far up this conspiracy reached, but she had one last card to play, one final piece of her mother's legacy to unlock. As she ran through the dark streets, Sarah pulled out her phone. The live stream was still running, the file size growing with each passing second, but it wasn't enough. She needed to access that final email, needed to understand what her mother had discovered in those last hours before her death. A car engine roared in the distance. They would be searching the streets soon. Sarah ducked into an abandoned storefront she remembered from her days on the streets, pressing herself into the deepest shadows. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the USB drive and plugged it into her phone. The final email loaded slowly, too slowly. Sarah could hear cars passing now, their headlights sweeping the empty streets. Emma stirred against her chest, making tiny sounds of distress. "Shh, sweet girl," Sarah whispered, rocking gently. "Just a little longer, I promise." Finally, the email opened. Sarah's breath caught as she read her mother's last words. "Michael, by the time you read this, I'll probably be dead. They know I made copies of everything, the Project Butterfly files, the trial data, the list of babies they've already taken. But they don't know about the failsafe. I set up a dead man's switch. If I don't enter a code every 24 hours, Everything gets sent to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country. The only thing stopping it was my login to the server. The password is Sarah's birthday. The username is the name we were going to give her if she'd been a boy, the one you suggested that night, before everything fell apart. I'm trusting this email to your conscience, Michael. Maybe you'll delete it without reading, like all the others. Maybe you'll finally face what you've allowed to happen. Either way, the truth will come out. It has to. Take care of our daughter. Catherine. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled up the secure server link she'd found in her mother's files. Username, Alexander. Password, 03151998. Her birthday. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen filled with files, hundreds of them. Clinical trials, financial records, emails discussing the disposal of failed test subjects. Everything her mother had discovered, everything she had died trying to expose. A noise outside made Sarah's head snap up. Footsteps, getting closer. She pressed the upload button, watching as the files began transferring to multiple servers. Then she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. "She has to be here somewhere," Rebecca said, too close. "The tracking device in the baby's bracelet shows she's within 100 feet. Sarah looked down at Emma's wrist, noticing for the first time the delicate silver bracelet that looked like a baby accessory. With careful fingers, she removed it, her street instincts telling her to create a false trail. She waited until the footsteps passed, then threw the bracelet as far as she could in the opposite direction. It clattered against something metal, the sound echoing in the quiet street. "Over there!" Multiple sets of feet ran toward the sound. Sarah used the distraction to slip out the back of the building into the maze of alleys she knew so well. The file transfer was at 89%, just a little longer. But as she rounded a corner, she found her path blocked. Michael stood there, alone, his face haggard in the dim light. "Sarah, stop," he said, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "Please, you don't understand what's at stake." "I understand everything," Sarah replied, backing away slowly. "I read Mom's email, the one you never opened. She trusted you to do the right thing, and you failed her, just like you failed me. I was trying to protect you both." Michael's voice cracked. "If I had exposed what was happening, they would have killed you too. At least this way you were alive." "Alive!" Sarah laughed bitterly. "I was 8 years old, living on the streets, watching my mother die. You call that protection?" Michael took a step forward, his eyes pleading. "Let me help you now. We can disappear together, you, me, and Emma, start fresh somewhere else." For a moment, Sarah almost wavered. The longing for family, for safety, for a father's protection, it pulled at something deep inside her. But then she remembered her mother's final days, remembered the babies who had died in those trials, remembered Emma's fever and the doctor's warnings. "No," she said firmly. "No more running, no more hiding. This ends tonight." Her phone beeped, 100% uploaded. Somewhere in the digital world, her mother's dead man's switch had finally triggered. The truth was spreading, unstoppable now. As if on cue, sirens began to wail in the distance. Not just police sirens, federal vehicles responding to the evidence that had just hit their servers. Sarah's live stream had given them probable cause. The Project Butterfly files had given them proof. Michael's face crumpled as he realized what was happening. "What have you done?" "What Mom tried to do," Sarah replied. "What you should have done years ago." More sirens joined the first, coming from all directions now. Sarah heard shouts of confusion from the search parties that had been hunting her. Running feet, cars starting, chaos erupting as people realized what was happening. And then, cutting through it all, came Emma's cry, loud and clear and healthy. No more drugs, no more experiments, just a baby who needed love and protection. Sarah looked at Michael one last time. "You have a choice now," she said quietly. "You can run, like they're all going to run, or you can finally do the right thing, tell the truth. Help me protect Emma." Michael stood frozen, tears streaming down his face. In the distance, red and blue lights began to flash against the buildings. The night was ending, and with it, all the secrets and lies that had destroyed so many lives. "I'm so sorry," Michael whispered. Then he turned and walked toward the approaching sirens, his hands raised in surrender. Sarah held Emma close, watching as justice finally arrived. Not just police, but FBI agents, federal prosecutors who had been quietly building a case for months, tipped off by an anonymous source, her mother's legacy finally bearing fruit. Rebecca and the distinguished man were caught trying to flee in the company helicopter. The security guards surrendered without a fight. And one by one, the full scope of Project Butterfly was exposed. The dead babies, the grieving parents who had been told their children died of natural causes, the millions made from illegal drug trials. Hours later, as the sun rose over the city, Sarah sat in a warm office, giving her statement to kind-faced agents who believed every word she said. Emma slept peacefully in her arms, free from drugs and experiments at last. "You'll both be placed in witness protection," an agent explained gently. "New identities, new location, complete security." "Together?" Sarah asked, her voice small. After everything, she couldn't bear to be separated from Emma. The agent smiled. "Together. In fact, given the circumstances and your clear bond with her, we're recommending you be granted permanent guardianship." Sarah looked down at Emma, feeling tears fill her eyes. Not tears of fear or pain this time, but of hope. They had survived. They were safe. They would be together. "Your mother would be proud," the agent added softly. "What she started, you finished. Because of you both, a lot of families will finally have answers, and no more babies will be hurt by these people." Sarah thought about her mother then, not the sick, desperate woman she'd become at the end, but the strong, principled person who had refused to look away from injustice, who had given her life to protect others. "Mom knew," she whispered to Emma. "She knew someone would finish what she started. She just didn't know it would be both of us." Outside, the city was waking up to headlines that would shock the nation. Inside, Sarah and Emma sat together, two survivors who had found each other against impossible odds. Two lives that had been meant for exploitation, transformed instead into a story of hope and redemption. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be trials, testimonies, new identities to adjust to, but they would face it together. The girl who had lost everything but never lost her humanity, and the baby who had helped her find it again. Sometimes family isn't about blood or birth. Sometimes it's about choice, about sacrifice, about love that survives the darkest nights and emerges stronger in the dawn. Sarah kissed Emma's forehead, feeling the baby's steady breathing against her chest. They were safe. They were together. They were free, and somewhere she knew her mother was smiling.